For
That's what I'm
instance,
trying to get at, your personal philosophy. What is the principle that you use to differentiate those actions that you think should be considered a crime from those that you should not?
you're speaking in terms of very, very abstract situations.
Well, let's talk about some concretes.
Okay.
Would you agree that murder should be a crime?
Well, I think that goes without saying.
Kidnapping. Let's see if we can identify a principle. How about kidnapping, stealing, and raping?
Any violent crime, as I mentioned, and it's
all of those four you would consider to be should be a crime.
It's pretty obvious that what a violent crime is. Anything that one person. If one person violates another person in a violent way by assaulting them or doing some kind of physical harm to them, I think it's very simple that is a crime, and I think that almost everybody would agree. Okay.
So then you would agree then that eating, reading, playing basketball, and interviewing should not be considered a crime, right?
Okay.
Okay. So the question is, what is the principle that integrates the first group and differentiates from the second?
The principle is that if somebody is doing something that is harming nobody, then it's obviously not a crime. If somebody is doing something that's harming another person or an individual in some way, then that is a crime. The crime can take a violent way. Okay, well then let's take crime can take a non-violent way. For instance,
let me ask you a question that is very important in New York, for example. If a person smokes a cigarette of marijuana or injects some heroin in his home without harming somebody else, should that be considered a crime?
According to the law of the state of New York, that is a crime.
Yeah, I know that.
Okay.
But I'm asking you, according to your principle, he's not harming somebody else. Should that be considered a crime?
I personally, I think that it's very, very difficult to say. I personally feel that it's certainly a crime if somebody injures another person. Now, the question is, if they injure themselves, is it a crime? Well, I think that if a person, if you're asking me, for instance, should drugs be legalized if someone's only going to use them on themselves, my answer to that would be no, because I think that certain drugs invariably lead toward violence. I think that if you look at the people who are incarcerated in New York State prisons, and I know a bit about it because I chaired a committee in Albany prior to coming to Congress, you find that 80% of them are cross-addicted. They're alcoholics and they're drug addicts, and the violent crime that they got into was a crime because they needed to support their habit. And so as a result of that, they needed to physically harm other people in order to support their habit. I would differentiate, personally, I would differentiate between marijuana, for instance, and heroin. I think you could make a case that heroin ought not to be legal and that marijuana perhaps ought to be decriminalized. I have voted that way in Albany, to decriminalize marijuana. I don't think there are blanket principles. I'm not going to be tied to any kind of blanket or rigid principles. I think that you have to make some common sense judgments in terms of what you feel when you're voting on these laws.
You don't use principles to make those common sense judgments?
I don't think that it's not a college course. It's a gut feeling in terms of what you believe to be right. And
well, suppose the majority have a gut feeling that's different than you. Do they have a right to impose it on you?
Well, it depends what you mean. We have majority...
Well, actions that don't harm other people. Initially you were saying that your principle was if something harms somebody else it should be a crime, if it doesn't, it shouldn't. But then you were saying that the use of drugs, even though it doesn't harm anybody, should still be considered to be a crime, at least in the case of heroin. So it seems that you're not applying that principle consistently.
No. I thought I made it clear that I don't think you can take a general principle and tie yourself down when you're legislating to that general principle. You cannot be rigid. You have to decide on the basis of common sense, what you feel, what your gut tells you, what your general philosophy is. You tie these things together, what the community is saying, you tie what your constituents want, you tie them all together, and you come up with a way you vote. Nothing is, very few things are 100% or 0%. There are all kinds of shades of gray.
Okay, do you think that the government...
Let me explain. So when you vote, you weigh a bill, and you say to yourself, well, I like these 6 aspects, but I don't like these 4 aspects. Do the 4 aspects outweigh the 6 aspects in terms of how I vote on the bill?
Okay, so you are...
Now, when you talk about
majority rules,